If I could ask the panelists to turn on your videos, and for Sarah, if you could start the recording for us, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar. Please note that your video and audio has been disabled. So if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A chat box, which is found at the bottom of your Zoom screen, to add questions at any time during the webinar. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available after the webinar on the INEE website. And if you registered for the webinar, then you'll also get an email with the recording in your inboxes. This webinar is also being closed captioned. So at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll also see an option to turn on closed captioning, which is available in English. The presentation will also be available along with the recording on the INEE website. So my name is Margie Bott. I am the Education Policy Coordinator at INEE, the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies. Many of you are familiar with the network, but for those of you who are not, I encourage you to go to inee.org and click on Join at the top right hand of the screen and become a member. INEE is an open global network of more than 16,000 individual members and 130 partner organizations in 190 countries. INEE members are NGO and UN personnel, Ministry of Education and other government staff, students, teachers, donors, and researchers who all work closely and collectively to achieve our goal of increasing access to quality education in emergency contexts. This panel presentation was originally scheduled to be presented at the Comparative and International Education Society Conference in March of this year, but due to the crisis, we were not able to attend and present. So we're glad to be able to offer this presentation via INEE and through this webinar. I want to introduce you to the chair for this webinar, Cornelia Janka. Cornelia is the moderator for today, and she currently leads EDC's Crisis, Conflict, and Violence team. And until December 2019, Cornelia was the director of the USAID Education in Crisis and Conflict Network. Cornelia also supports INEE's work through her co-chair position of the Education Policy Working Group and as a co-convener of the Alternative Education Work Stream. So I'll pass it on to Cornelia to get us going. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Margie, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today as we share with you some new research and some case studies related to alternative education. So after I take you through some brief introductions of our panelists and describe what led us to this webinar today, we'll dive into our presentations. There'll be 4 in total. They'll each be about 12 minutes. And then we'll spend a good amount of time at the end with questions and answers. So please do feel free to post those. So I'll start with my introduction of Martha Hewison, who will be the discussant today. Martha is the UNHCR Education Advisor for Accelerated Education. Martha also chairs the Accelerated Education Working Group, which aims to improve the quality of accelerated education programs globally. Prior to her current role, Martha has worked for over 20 years in the education sector for INGOs, the UN, donors, and governments, mostly in East, West, and Southern Africa, and with a particular focus on education in conflict and post-conflict contexts. Next, I'd like to introduce Kayla Boisvert. She is an independent consultant with over 15 years experience in program implementation and research and evaluation in education and social services. Her areas of expertise include education in emergencies, alternative and accelerated education for out-of-school children and youth, and research methodology. She and her colleague Jen Fleming worked on the background and discussion papers you'll learn about today. So as I mentioned, Jen Fleming is also a panelist. She is a research and evaluation specialist focused on education, youth, and protection in humanitarian contexts. She has over 10 years of experience working directly with refugee and IDP populations in program implementation, research, and evaluation capacities. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Julia Finder-Jonah. She is the Education and Emergencies Advisor at Save the Children US, and she'll be presenting on Save the Children's work in Lebanon today. Julia has over 12 years of varied teaching, project management, and advisory experience in domestic and international contexts, ranging from classrooms in inner city Chicago and rural Cambodia to refugee communities and internally displaced populations in the Middle East and East and West Africa. Alison Krupar, also with Save the Children US, also presenting on Save's work in Lebanon today, is a senior specialist for learning and research, and she also is an adjunct faculty at American University. Alison specializes in research, monitoring, and evaluation of education programs, particularly on conflict-affected and crisis environments, and aiming at overage children and youth. Next, we have Jackie Kiernan. She is a project director at Education Development Center, and she'll be presenting on EDC's Integrated Youth, what does that stand for? I should know. IYDA project in the DRC. Jackie spent nearly 10 years in the DRC working in education, youth, and management roles for UNICEF, Search for Common Ground, and CARE. And then Pete Sims, who is the Senior Education Advisor at Plan International in Canada, will be presenting on Plan's work in the Philippines today. Originally a primary school teacher, Pete has supported education systems as a teacher trainer and advisor to ministries of education and within UN agencies and INGOs. So that's it for the panelists. And now we can move on to a little bit of background. Right, so in 2019, the INEE Accelerated Education Workstream hired Jen and Kayla for a consultancy. We, on the work stream, many of us have worked and do work in alternative education and with the alternative education programs in crisis and conflict. And we recognized that in our work, there were many different ways that people referred to the kind of education that we were providing to adolescents and youth. We called it alternative education or non-formal education and many other names. And we thought it would be really helpful to try and get our arms around the very varied terms that were used to describe it, and also really document the challenges that adolescents and youth who were not able to attend formal school had for accessing education and for quality learning experiences. So we developed this consultancy, and the three aims of the consultancy were, as we see here, articulate the existing needs and constraints of conflict and crisis affected adolescents and youth ages 12 to 24, provide initial guidance considerations to policymakers and providers related to these needs and challenges, and then build a shared language and understanding around alternative education through the development of taxonomy and of various types of alternative education currently being used in crisis and conflict affected contexts. Next slide. So the consultancy has resulted in two products that you will hear more about next. The first is a background paper and a landscape review that does put forward a taxonomy for non-formal education for adolescents and youth in crisis and conflict. And the second is a discussion paper that looks at the issues and considerations for non-formal education for adolescents and youth in crisis and conflict. And with that, I will turn it over to Jen and Kayla.
Great, you can go to the next slide, please. And excellent, actually jump one more. Thank you. Great, thanks Cornelia. So I'm gonna start off and then I'll hand it over to Jen, who will then describe the taxonomy in a bit more detail. So as Cornelia mentioned, the purpose of our work was to respond to the lack of an agreed upon definition or definitions and an agreed upon taxonomy for non-formal education and alternative education programs for out-of-school adolescents and youth in crisis and conflict. To do this, we developed a background paper and proposed definitions and taxonomy to support policymakers and practitioners in order to develop a shared understanding of such programs. And we considered two important points, but there were many other things that we took into consideration as well. Those considerations included, first, Noting, as Cornelia mentioned, that the terms non-formal and alternative education are used quite differently in different locations, and they're often used interchangeably or conflated. And we wanted to ensure that we are not contributing to the ongoing conflation of terms, but rather to explore the similarities and differences in order to provide a bit more clarity. And we also acknowledge that language and context matter extensively. So different terms are used in different locations, as I mentioned, and our goal was not to rigidly enforce a new terminology, but rather to offer some clarity and common ground, common understanding. Our process involved a deep dive literature review that first explored the history of the terms and the contemporary uses of the different terms, and second, systematically analyzed both academic and gray literature written about different types of non-formal and alternative education for out-of-school adolescents and youth in crisis and conflict. And we also looked at programmatic literature to fill gaps specifically. We sought out literature that ensured representation both geographically and of different program types, but we also do want to note a limitation, which is that we were limited to English-only documents, and those tended to be written by large donors or international NGOs. And we're happy to talk a bit more about our process as needed. From the historical lit review, we found two main contemporary issues that made it particularly important and timely to develop a clearer articulation of the types of programs that exist outside of formal schooling, and to gain and seek consensus on what we're calling them. So the first is the shift of non-formal education towards providing an alternative pathway for out-of-school children and youth, and that followed from the Jomshin Convention, the Education for All movement, into the MDGs and SDGs, and it's emphasized, of course, in the Education Cannot Wait strategy. Second is the push for recognizing, validating, and accrediting learning outcomes within non-formal education programs. So really, it's for these reasons that the unique categories and differentiation between the different types of categories or types of programs that are outside of the formal education system are useful and valuable and timely. And now I will turn it over to Jen.
Thanks, Kayla. And could we go 2 slides up now, please? Yes, the next one. So I'm going to introduce our taxonomy. From our review of the literature, as well as a very collaborative process with the alternative education workstream over probably about 6 months, we developed this taxonomy. And I'm going to go over the specific parts of the taxonomy as well as the definitions. Taxonomy differentiates in the dark green boxes, the delineation first between formal and non-formal education. And then within non-formal education, 3 types of programs: transitional education programs, alternative education, and then other non-formal education programs. And then attached to both the formal and the non-formal options is this category of support services. So go and do a slide. So first we're going to take a look at non-formal education, this box here. So slide again. So per our review of the literature, we put forth this definition of non-formal education, again, based on definitions and history and collaboration with the work stream. Here we define non-formal education as the overarching term that refers to planned, structured and organized education programming that is outside of the formal education system. Some types of NFE lead to equivalent certified competencies, while others do not. Non-formal education programs are characterized by their variety, by their flexibility, and ability to respond quickly to new educational needs of learners in a given context, as well as their holistic, learner-centered pedagogy. So a few key points stood out to us in our review. First, in keeping with many earlier definitions, including the UNESCO definition, we kept the term NFE as an umbrella term to describe all types of planned, structured education that is outside of the formal system. So this excludes informal learning, which occurs when knowledge and skills are naturally obtained through day-to-day activities and interactions outside of structured education, but it is often conflated and used within the literature, within programs. And then secondly, that non-formal education is often characterized by flexibility and learner-centered pedagogy, particularly to meet the needs of out-of-school adolescents and youth. So slide. So now we'll dive into the two different types of NFE that we classified, which were the light green boxes in the original taxonomy, but are highlighted here. And slide again. So first is alternative education. Alternative education is planned, structured education programming for out-of-school young people, and it leads to equivalent certified competencies in academic or technical vocational subjects. Alternative education programs offer a flexible education option for out-of-school adolescents and youth to gain essential knowledge, skills, and attitudes in order to transition to further education or training or to develop their livelihoods. These programs may be fully academic in nature with similar curriculum to formal schools, or they may be skills-based in order to lead to improved livelihoods and employment opportunities. And to meet the needs of young people who are out of school, alternative education programs are flexible and often holistic in nature. So they may be fully or partially managed by national education actors, or they may be striving for integration into national systems. Alternative education programs tend to have or are striving for nationally approved curricula, certified and trained teachers, and lead to certification for learners. And in fact, certification and competency is equivalent to the formal school system, including for skills-based alternative education programs, as well as the intensity and structure of these programs is really what differentiates them from what we classified as the other non-formal education programs. And some examples of alternative education programs would be accelerated education programs, alternative basic education, second chance programs, or youth livelihoods education and training programs. So we will slide. So then the second category here was the other non-formal education box. Other NFE is education programming for young people who are out of school that does not lead to equivalent certified competencies. These programs may be temporary, ad hoc, or provide reduced or partial curriculum. These types of programs are often less intensive. They might be less structured than the alternative education programs are. They may be focused on academic or technical vocational skills, as well as learning readiness or language development. So these programs also tend to have a strong protective function or a framework of protection. So the non-formal education category does, however, exclude programs that have psychosocial well-being or protection as their sole function, as their sole purpose. So for example, something like recreational programs, but we didn't capture those sorts of programs in this taxonomy. And what we call other NFE programs often exist in acute humanitarian crises. And these will be in contexts where an alternative or formal education system either does not exist, has been destroyed, or students cannot access them. And students may lack explicit pathways into formal or alternative education. And so some examples of this other NFE category include short-term or infrequent classroom-based programs, such as language classes a few days a week, drop-in classes, as well as short-term content-based programs. So for example, say a 3-week technical course, such as design, computer skills, project-based learning. It would also include less intensely structured classroom programming. And this might include something like untrained teachers, school that's offered a few days a week for maybe only a few hours a day. And then also it will include something like project-based learning activities or experiential learning that are learning centered, but definitely outside of the classroom. You can slide. So now we'll take a quick look at the transitional programs, which we have in the yellow box, as well as the blue support services, which applies to both the formal and non-formal categories. Slide, please. Perfect, thank you. So transitional programs are short-term educational programs that help learners transition into the formal sector or into alternative education programming. So they alone will not lead to certification or equivalent competencies, but rather they will help learners transition into programs that do. They're often implemented by NGOs. And some examples of transitional programs are catch-up programs, which help learners who have missed less than a year of school and need to catch up to their peers. We're likely to see a lot of this as we return to learning post-COVID-19. Bridging programs, which help learners learn a new language or adapt to a new curriculum in order to access formal or alternative education programs. And then learning readiness courses as well. Slide. And then finally, support services. So we specified in the taxonomy a place for these type of programs, even though they don't necessarily fall directly under the umbrella term of non-formal education. They're very often very essential programming options that apply to both the non-formal and formal sectors. And again, very timely given COVID. So support services include programming offered to students in addition to their formal or non-formal education studies. These may be in the form of standalone or after-school programs, or they may simply be integrated into the curriculum that students are already participating in. And some examples of support services include tutoring and after-school support, remedial education such as pull-out classes, dropout prevention or learning readiness, or distance learning to supplement instructional time or for remediation. And that's the taxonomy.
Great, thanks, Jen. So just to wrap up, the presentations that follow will explore several different examples of programs that fall into the different categorizations that we've proposed. For example, Julia and Allison will talk a bit about a bridging program that falls under what we're calling the transitional program category. Jackie and Heidi will be looking at a combined youth education and workforce program that we might classify under alternative education. And Pete will talk to us about both a primary equivalence program and a youth skills program, which we also might classify under alternative education. And finally, we just wanted to note that, as Cornelia mentioned, the follow-on to this background paper was a discussion paper that delved into some specific issues and considerations that are relevant to non-formal education, noting that we did not touch on everything. It's not comprehensive, but it's some of the major themes that kept coming up. And those issues and considerations were related to funding, legal and policy environments, flexibility, relevance and holistic programming, psychosocial support, equivalence and certification, transition, and the engagement of young people. So we look forward to exploring in the upcoming presentations a bit more about the different programs and the specific issues that they have contended with. Thank you very much. And over to, I believe it's Julia and Allison.
Thanks, Kayla. So good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking to you about a bridging program called Return to Learning. And this presentation will share our experience in developing, implementing, and evaluating this bridging program with out-of-school children in Lebanon. And we'll specifically highlight the findings that draw on both our quantitative learning outcome measures as well as our qualitative research. So just to highlight that during the implementation of this program, we did find small but significant learning gains, and we have extensive qualitative findings from this pilot about how to best implement alternative education that does focus on social emotional learning in protracted refugee environments. And we also learned from our qualitative findings how to best support children to transition into other non-formal education programs and when possible into formal schools. So next slide, please. So as I said, during this presentation, we will highlight the program design, our evaluation, and also share some of our lessons learned from implementing our Return to Learning bridging program. Just to give a bit of context, this program was implemented in 2019 in Bekaa in Lebanon. As many of you probably know, the formal education system in Lebanon has been struggling to accommodate the nearly 1.5 million Syrian refugees that have been displaced there. And we know from various data that almost 500,000 Syrian refugee children are out of school or have missed out on sometimes several years of schooling as a result of this crisis. And we also know that there is extensive data about the gaps in education that these children face. And so for this pilot, we focused on identifying 600 out-of-school children to participate in this bridging program. Next slide, please. So what is our Return to Learning program? To bridge these identified learning gaps, we developed and tested an alternative education program that focuses on supporting the reintegration of out-of-school children into longer-term non-formal education programs and/or formal school. And while we know that alternative education programs vary widely, and as Kayla and Jennifer just talked to us about all of the different types of alternative education programs, we know that there often is a focus on children's well-being, that it tends to kind of be this recurring theme, particularly in emergency affected contexts. And so our Return to Learning program uses a play-based approach that focuses on developing children's social emotional learning, literacy, and numeracy skills to really help support their safe return to structured learning environments that promote their well-being. So children remember what it's like to sit in a learning space, to listen to their teacher, to interact with their peers, since we know they've spent varying amounts of time without access to learning opportunities. In Lebanon, we were lucky that language of instruction was not such a big issue as it is in other contexts. And as you heard Kayla and Jennifer mention, oftentimes these bridging programs do focus on language because they need to. But for us, we were more focused on making sure that these out-of-school children would really be ready to hit the ground running by the time they entered these longer-term, either non-formal education programs or formal school. So this research will present the first evaluation of this bridging program. And with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Ali, that will talk us through some of the methodology and the findings.
Thanks, Julia. Can we have the next slide, please? Great. So over the last decade, learning assessments have become more and more common in low and middle income countries. We have EGRA, we have ACER, and the International Development and Early Learning Assessment, IDELA, all supporting evidence-based education programming and decision-making in low and middle income countries. However, we have less data and less assessments that we can use in conflict and forced displacement contexts. So with that in mind, we developed the holistic assessment of learning and development outcomes, which we piloted in Kenya and Uganda before we used it in this study in Lebanon. So HALDA was developed to be used in emergency settings, refugee environments, rapid onset displacement contexts. Can we go back a slide? Sorry. Rapid onset displacement context, and to assess children's learning needs in displacement. So the tool targets 4 to 12-year-olds and includes literacy, numeracy, and social emotional learning domains. Now we can go to the next slide. In this bridging program, we wanted HALDA results to be useful during the program implementation to support a data-driven approach. So in this study, aggregate center-based HALDA results, not linked to individual children, were shared with facilitators to identify emergent, foundational, intermediate, and advanced skills that we measured by the tool. We created thresholds based on the results for these categories that were contextually relevant. HALDO is not an individual diagnostic assessment, although the social emotional learning, literacy, and numeracy domains map well to school readiness assessments in the literature. It is yet to be tested as a specific school readiness tool and will need contextualization in each national and local context to adequately measure specific grade level readiness. However, it does show us general skill levels that are often measured in school readiness assessments. With this in mind, our results focus on both the qualitative data and results from HALDO to help us understand this case study of the transitional and bridging program in Lebanon. We also use facilitator observations and focus group discussions with caregivers, facilitators, and children participating in the project, as Julia mentioned. These findings focus on implementation fidelity, while the quantitative findings outline the effect of the program using HALDO. The mixed methods approach allowed for a deeper dive into the ecology and implementation of return to learning. Next slide, please. So the purpose of return to learning is to improve readiness, not to show marked improvement in literacy, numeracy, and social emotional skills after such a brief intervention. We see here higher rates, high inter-rater reliability and internal consistency within the domains that we measured by HALDO, signifying that the tool is reliable and valid in context. The study was a quasi-experimental design with 2 cohorts. So the 600 children were divided into cohort 1 and cohort 2, 300 in each, and they were assessed together in cohort 1 were assessed together at baseline, followed by cohort 1 receiving the intervention, and then cohort 2. So the small significant gains we found from baseline to end line for each cohort motivate further study about how the program may have been related to those gains and how those gains may affect school readiness. Next slide, please. For the qualitative results, we collected data and focus group discussions with 53 children, 34 parents, and 16 facilitators. We also conducted 16 facilitator observations in the classroom. This data helps us understand the implementation fidelity of the program, what occurred in the classroom, and which children, their caregivers, and facilitators identified as needs, what they identified as needs to integrate into other educational programs. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read out the findings here, but we can discuss this in more depth in the Q&A for those who are interested in the implementation fidelity data and what it can mean for school readiness. Next slide. So what about school readiness? We have data about children's outcomes relevant to the Bridge program and data about their experience in the program. But we wanted to see what happened after the program as children integrated into formal and non-formal education programs. We were able to track 66 children from Return to Learning who participated in an early childhood development program in 2019. So this is the younger children who participated in the program. Children who participated in this Bridge program had significantly higher gains than their peers who do not. So participating in Return to Learning helped children improve from baseline to end line in the ECCD program more than not having participated in anything. We also saw that children with the higher levels had higher gains across the board, which you can see in the ECCD level line. These results are preliminary, and we hoped to further test children's learning gains associated with the participation in Return to Learning this year, but that has been put on hold due to school closures related to COVID-19. So now I'm going to turn it back to Julia to talk about our next steps.
Thanks, Allie. And this again is something we can discuss during the Q&A for people that have more questions about it. But as Allie mentioned, we did see positive results for children ages 4 to 6 that participated in Return to Learning prior to entering a longer term government approved ECCD program. And so we are interested in looking at, those other signs of improved readiness at different levels. So looking at how it impacts children as they transition into non-formal education programs that are of the primary school age. We're also interested in looking at sort of the longer term impact. So trying to see how this participating in this program ends up influencing children's retention in school and contributing to reduced dropout rates. We're also looking at how we can use this type of a program in places where children have been able to immediately transition into formal schools, but need some of that remedial support, especially when it comes to supporting their well-being so that they can better cope with not only the academic content, but also with integrating into this new community. And so in some of our work in Colombia, we'll be looking at how this is impacting their ability to retain in school and also catch up. So with that, I think we can stop there, and hopefully you'll have some questions during the Q&A for us.
Jackie, I think we're over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. As mentioned in the introduction, today I'm going to be sharing with you some of the approaches that we have used in the integrated youth development activity that EDC is implementing in the provinces of North and South Kivu and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Next slide, please. So as I'm sure many of you know, the context of Eastern DRC is quite volatile. There are currently over 4 million IDPs throughout the country, most of whom are located in the eastern provinces of North and South Kivu, as well as Tanganyika and Ituri. The population in the DRC is over 60% under 20 years old, meaning that more than half of the population in the country has grown up knowing high levels of violence, conflict, poor governance, and displacement. Despite this, we have a youth population that is vibrant. They have strong views and aspirations. There's a strong potential to tap into youth as role models, mentors, and leaders. So the networking among youth we see as an opportunity. And we have a population of youth that value their future potential around earnings, specifically entering the job market for either wage employment or garnering income through entrepreneurship. Education is also a priority among the youth population, which is seen as a pathway to gaining a livelihood. However, despite these positive characteristics of the youth population, the context is challenging. The access to social services is limited and of very poor quality due to the protracted nature of the crises and the multiple decades of conflict in the region. You know, some of the language used around the education system in the DRC, coming out of USAID analyses, for example, is a completely devastated system. The adult perception of youth in this context is that youth are victims, they're delinquents, they're idlers, so there's quite a large disconnect between the generations. The fact that youth are growing up under the perpetual threat and actual reality of violence and displacement means that there are high levels of trauma. There's the introduction of terror from quite a young age, feelings of terror. There's distrust within the community, between communities, and of course with the state and external service providers, including the international humanitarian and development community. There are extremely difficult and tense dynamics within the country, which makes implementation very challenging. One of the quotes that I really have appreciated in the research that's been done on the youth population is to the right of your screen, talking about how youth are largely disenfranchised and socioeconomically distressed, with little relief coming from the government. So this places the youth in a very vulnerable position where they are vulnerable to armed groups' coercion and recruitment, noting that many of the youth are joining armed groups because they're motivated by economic hardships. The literacy rates in the areas where we're working are incredibly high, even for youth that are in school. They're estimated at around 40%. And we note that only 18% of the youth that are graduating from primary school are continuing on to secondary school. Next slide, please. So within this context, we have the IYDA intervention. The IYDA intervention is a really comprehensive intervention that provides youth with various pathways that can be categorized as non-formal education opportunities. And these pathways are open to the youth based on their own objectives, ambitions, and their own experience within the education system. So if you look at our overall goal, we're looking at increasing youth resilience to conflict and violence through improved access to gain relevant skills and educational and social outcomes, looking at improving youth opportunity to positively engage in community activities through civic engagement, and then looking at youth's access to economic activities. Today I'm going to speak primarily about what we're doing in the education track of the intervention. So if you can move on to the next slide, please. We're working with youth that are between the ages of 13 and 35, although most of our youth are actually between the ages of 11 and 18. Pathway 1, we are working with accelerated education centers. And this we're categorizing as, if we look back at the taxonomy that had been presented earlier on, this is an alternative education intervention. It's covering grades 5 and 6 for primary and preparing youth to take the primary school exit exam. Most of these have already passed through levels 1 and 2, so they've covered 6 years of primary school in a condensed 3-year period. The intervention focuses a lot on quality. Most of the accelerated education centers in the DRC have not had access to curriculum that meets their specific lesson planning and educational objectives. So the teachers are required to look at curriculum that's been developed for grades 5 and 6 and pick and choose what they can fit into a 1-year period. What we've done is worked with the Ministry of Education to develop curriculum specific for the condensed 1-year period. Youth also have an option to follow Pathway 2, and these are generally older youth who find that going back to school is not within their kind of life plan. And so these are looking at supporting vocational training centers. This is categorized within the taxonomy as other non-formal education opportunities, specifically because youth coming out of these programs do not receive a nationally recognized certificate, and there are no minimum standard oversight mechanisms that are currently in place. Youth are accessing basic literacy and numeracy curriculum, some of which has been developed through our intervention, and they're also accessing some social emotional learning curriculum that I'll speak about at the end of this slide. Pathway 3 is support to community-based literacy programs. So these are in areas where local NGOs are kind of supplementing or replacing opportunity for non-formal education opportunities. They're run by civil society. They are programs that usually touch on some sort of vocational and technical training opportunities and try their best to pick up the youth that have less access to the non-formal education opportunities that are more linked to the government's strategy. And finally, we have Pathway 0, which are the youth who are members in SILC groups. These are lending and savings community groups, also known as VSLA groups to some of you. It's a 3-year program, as I mentioned, implemented in Eastern DRC. I think one of the main added values of the work that we're doing with these providers of the various pathways is introducing really high quality social emotional learning curriculum that is really geared towards meeting the aspirations of the youth. And so we're using EDC's renowned workforce development curriculum known as Work Ready Now. So this touches on interpersonal and individual development skills framed within materials that are preparing youth to enter the workforce. And this is recognizing that the priority of most of the youth that we're working with are looking to transition to the workforce. Those in Pathway 2, 3, and 0 get additional curriculum that is called Be Your Own Boss, and that's really helping them develop a business plan and guide them through their entrepreneurship journey. The reason why the youth in Pathway 1 are not getting the Be Your Own Boss material is primarily because they're younger, and we're really hoping that they would transition to secondary school. Next slide, please. So in recognition of the context, And I think really linking into some of the findings that were presented in the issues and considerations document, especially about the necessity to support the psychosocial needs of the beneficiary population. We have introduced some really relevant and well-received curriculum that work with teachers to build their own ability to promote mental health and address trauma that they may have faced, to better position them to support the youth in their classrooms, address their own experience of violence and trauma. So, you know, we're also acknowledging that in most of the schools that the youth are accessing, they are relatively inferior education systems and facilities. Students are finding themselves attending schools in insecure environments. They're exposed to sexual and gender-based violence within and outside of the school. There's extremely poor infrastructure. Teachers are generally demotivated. They're definitely lacking training, and they're struggling with their own traumas and challenges. Some of the data that we've collected indicate that almost 20% of the teachers that we've worked with are reporting that they've lost control. They've yelled or used physical aggression against students in the past 3 months. Teachers are able to articulate that the trauma that they've experienced, including displacement and violence, as well as living under extreme fear, is still affecting them. Less than half of the students that we're working with report to have highly positive relationships with their teachers, and we'd really like to move the needle significantly in that area. 80% of teachers report that they have had a discussion with at least one student in the last 3 months about their student's trauma, indicating high levels of trauma amongst the student population. And what we see as a great opportunity is that 99% of the teachers that we're working with say that they would like and that they need more training on how to support their students who have histories of trauma. So this is a recognized need. This is not something that we're bringing in from the outside. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we have built and introduced resilience and healthy coping skills curriculum among teachers in the DRC. This process was led by a clinical psychologist who worked with the project team to understand the context. She developed evidence-informed curriculum for teachers, adapted this to the context using concepts and interventions that were based on best practices worldwide, and that took into account the development level, literacy levels, language, and culturally held values amongst our schools. The focus has really been on behavior change and coping skill development. We then moved on to training of the trainers in a 3-day workshop and used a cascade system to now have those master trainers go out into the field and to train teachers and school directors in the curriculum development. Next slide, please. So this just gives you an overview of the training curriculum. It's a 16-hour course. Evidence-based concepts have been designed for non-clinical staff. So we have a clinical psychologist developing this, but in a way that makes sense to non-clinical staff. We have a whole manual of trainer tips and accompanying participant guides. We've developed, which is super interesting, audio instruction for mindful meditation to reduce anxiety and depression. So these self-help coping skills are all evidence-based, and they've been proven to reduce anxiety, depression, and/or anger. And they also include progressive muscle relaxation and anger management support. And as you can see on the table to the right, the first session really works on the individual becoming aware of their feelings and their reactions to the feelings. Session 2 talks about better self-care mechanisms. And then session 3 goes into how can that translate into better supporting students. We've had some really great results. If you go to the next slide, there's a few final slides on some of what we found between the pre and the post tests. So percentage of teachers who report to know how to control their anger, worry, and/or sad feelings when needed there was a significant increase between 47, 48%, all the way up to 72%. On the next slide, we look at the percent of teachers who believe that they can talk about a student's abuse and traumatic experience in a way that helps and does not harm the student. It was also a significant increase. The next slide shows an increase in the percentage of teachers who believe personal experiences with family or community violence continues to affect them. And this one is really showing an increased level of self-awareness about some of the feelings and reactions individuals are having and may not understand where they're stemming from. And finally, oh, is that the last one? The percentage of teachers who would like more training continues to remain very high. I think what I would like to just end with is just to reiterate that this is going beyond the more traditional psychosocial support that has been quite prevalent in the East and very focused on sexual and gender-based violence, to look at how to address the needs of students in non-formal education settings, and through quality teacher service provision and interventions that are based on evidence-based theory and findings. And that is it. I think the last slide is just a thank you slide.
Thanks so much, Jackie. Over to you, Pete.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, hear you clearly.
Yeah, okay, great. I'll try and be relatively quick because I know we want to try and get to the discussion by about 11 o'clock. So I'm just going to talk for a couple of minutes about a program that Plan International implements in the Philippines, delivering a few different forms of alternative education. So respond to a couple of the types of examples that were provided in the taxonomy, and it'd be interesting to compare against some of the other ones that have been presented by the other discussants here. So we'll jump in straight away. Can we go to the next slide? So in terms of the situation in the Philippines, many people might know a bit more about it. There's quite a large number of children who are out of school, and then also quite a lot who are there intermittently. Dropout is high. There are a lot of opportunities to return to the formal system, and that's in primary and secondary. But for a range of reasons, a range of challenges, there's a lot of need for alternative programs to reintroduce people or to provide catch-up programs, and again across different parts of the country. So this project was an attempt to try and counter some of these particular challenges, and we'll go into a few of those specifics that were there. In terms of the number of kids, it's about 25 million at the moment who are out of school, actually slightly higher. There's been a lot of gains in education, but still huge improvements needed because of particular disparities. We've seen that around gender, younger boys who are out of school, older adolescent girls particularly, and then also around the income inequalities and differences of being in rural or disaster or conflict areas as well. Next slide. Some of the marginalized groups who these projects tried to target particularly were around, for example, girls who were married early, teen mothers, parents, or women who may be the heads of households. Again, people who are poor and remote from particular minority groups, which is an additional challenge in many parts of the Philippines. And then those who work, and because of the nature of the sort of a range of challenges around disaster and conflict affected communities in the Philippines, quite a flexibility in how these responses adapt. We also then talk about children with disabilities and a range of illnesses as well. The reasons why they might not be in school are sort of a product of all of that. Adolescent pregnancy, gender norms and stereotypes are fairly entrenched, poverty, child labour, and then just simple inaccessibility. Quality is also a key issue as well, which we'll come to. Next slide. So the intervention that was provided by Plan International in partnership with some local NGOs and with the relevant Ministry of Education and its line ministries was called the Real Assets and Improved Skills and Education for Girls Project, or RAISE, and it aimed to do a couple of things, as you'll see here. Overall, it was about providing opportunities to either have flexible learning strategies to reintegrate back into school, or for accessing various forms of non-formal education, even if they were not going to return to school. There were re-entry points to primary and to secondary. We'll be focusing more on the secondary here. But it was also about providing a wider set of what we would call personal and social assets. So life skills, including adolescent sexual and reproductive health, connection to peer groups, clubs, savings groups, and then also linking with more technical and vocational training. So it was certainly about re-entry and points of transition into education and back into education and so forth, and into technical vocational, but a wider set of support structures that we thought and we believe are necessary to improve, to support learning and to support the overall wellness of the young people in question. And we can see that a bit in the next slide. Here you can see some of the wider activities. I'll put a circle around the two mechanisms that we're going to focus on, which is around, one was called the alternative learning system, which is about re-entry or entry into primary school, and then the open high school program and the alternative learning system also for the secondary level. But there's a wide range of other activities that we've included on here, as you can see, around engaging with community and parents, advocating for them to be able to go to school, and then advocating with other groups within the community or at the national level, including things like education grants, youth groups and leadership training. Youth peer education was a big part of this program, youth savings groups. I won't go into all of the details about those elements, but I think it's important to show that it's, for us, certainly these activities in the Philippines were part of a wider set of activities and that were necessary to sort of scaffold and support the particular alternative education mechanisms that were implemented. And that's sometimes what we experienced was lacking previously. So these, for example, the alternative learning system is a government authorized, accredited program that then is supported by NGOs in terms of delivery, but they don't necessarily demand or require the other elements to be added to this, such as engagement at the community level or the advocacy, the influencing elements, and particularly the grants or the peer education parts around ASRH. So we then thought those were quite necessary. We found them to be particularly valued as well. In terms of the core activities around these education mechanisms, on the next slide, in terms of these are pathways to basic education within the Philippines, there's obviously the regular school being the primary direction, and that's still obviously the priority function. The two alternatives that are below, what we call these flexible learning strategies. The alternative delivery mode is one, and it captures a few different ones that we'll talk about, and then the alternative learning system is another one. On the next slide. So in terms of the alternative delivery mode that was part of this RAISE project, a key, and again, there are different elements of it, but one that I want to highlight was the open high school program. This was essentially for secondary school age students who weren't able to attend for a range of reasons, particularly because they can't access physically school. That might be because of disaster, or because the school has been forced to close, or maybe demands of work and the influence of poverty and so forth. So it provides a distance and a flexible learning one, where essentially it's student managed. They get a range of materials, printed materials that they're given, and some guidance on how to manage their work on a day-to-day or week-by-week basis, and those called self-instructional modules. And there's distance supports from teachers, and then also teacher support who will go to students' houses where able. And basically it allows them to, children who can complete the program can either re-enroll if they're able to, or simply complete the junior high school and enroll into senior high school, or maybe another form of TVET or another alternative education model. So it's almost like a distance high school program. The key part is that it's student managed. That does put some demands on the learner. Not necessarily every child will be in a position to be able to make use of that. So there's quite a lot of coaching that has to go along with it to make sure that people are able to support that the household is able to support. But if possible and if relevant, it allows to overcome that distance and that flexibility, so that essentially these young people and adolescents may well be either deal with the requirements of the household if they're often female, or work if they're often male. So that's the first one, the open high school program. The second one that we looked at on the next slide was through the alternative learning system, the ALS system. This was specifically for out of school children and youth. So the previous one was for those who are in school age, but an alternate model for them. This was for out of school and largely for those who may not be likely to return. It's possible that they can, and a key point of this is the transition. You'll see the arrows between these different areas of regular school, alternative delivery models for regular school, and then alternative learning systems as well. And there are entry points, and that's a key requirement. But that it's not a demand. It doesn't mean that it has to happen. So, for example, this is a parallel system to the formal approach of primary and secondary. Again, people who are unlikely or aware that where it's less relevant for them to return, certainly to the primary level, but also maybe to the junior or senior secondary level. It uses, again, self-instruction modules. It's highly flexible in terms of location and schedule. We try to use centers where possible, so physical centers so that people can gather together, but it doesn't always have to be like that as well. It's outside classrooms and it's facilitator led. Accreditation is provided and equivalency, so it's recognized, it's certified by the Ministry of Education. And it qualifies them to return to shift into formal, but more likely to vocational and technical skills as well. On the next slide. So as we were saying, this project facilitated the process of movement between these areas as required. Again, some people completed the open high school program and then continued into the alternative learning system as well, or vice versa, or where possible they went into the regular school, although obviously the reasons why they wouldn't necessarily be able to go into the regular school in the first place would likely still be in existence. On the next slide, we've got some of the achievements from the project. In the alternative learning system, we were able, simply put, to reach a larger number of learners who would otherwise not be able to have an education or would be severely limited from receiving a proper education. That meant bringing back children who dropped out or contributing to lower dropouts in school because they could retain the links to the formal system through the open high school program. But then also teachers report becoming more sensitive, understanding and nurturing of students. And this is where it links to some of those wider activities that were done. Teacher training is a big part of that as well, so that they're aware, knowledgeable, sensitive of the needs of students in these kind of circumstances, so that schools can reintegrate them when necessary. All of these alternative models can be adapted to those kind of considerations of the student's circumstance, their psychological conditions, anything kind of like that. And the teachers appear to be far more aware and far more able as well to respond to those kind of needs. Children themselves reported increased confidence and motivation to study. And overall, there was an improved interaction among school actors. Next slide. We had some key lessons learned. In the first one, it was about reaching the marginalized to show, we realized that the regular system was not really going to be able to deal with the flexible nature, the multiple barriers and the inequalities as to why these children and young people particularly were out of school, and that therefore an alternative model was definitely required. The lessons from raised was that we addressed those multiple barriers, particularly around flexibility in terms of timing, in terms of location, accessibility. The compressed courses themselves were highly successful. People appreciated being able to run through material much more quickly than they would have to do if they'd return to a lower grade in the primary or the secondary system. And then obviously certification of learning and the acquisition of skills. Next slide. This was a key finding for us from from both parts, but particularly the out of school youth were more concerned with getting jobs rather than completing education. They recognized the necessity of having credentialized education and that would support that process, but it was the link to the job market and the relevance that had that was considered to be more important. And then for that reason, we were built up with the links with the job market where possible, and integrated vocational technical skills into the alternative learning system to increase the enrollment and the retention. And that was one of the major positives that was promoted by it. On the next slide. Another element, and again, this is some of the wider support outside of the core educational delivery, was the youth peer education component where we established sort of support groups among adolescents and young people where they could work with each other in terms of learning, but also and share with each other and teach each other, but also around issues particularly to do with gender-based inequalities and issues to do with self-esteem, decision-making. They developed their own materials for IEC materials, and then we had what we would call these youth peer education corners that was sometimes expanded into the schools, formal schools themselves, once children then returned, and it was cascaded to children who were outside schools as well. We did have a finding that there was insufficient linkages to health services. That was a demand and something that was promoted, that was asked for by many young people in the evaluation for a range of reasons, and that's something that would be integrated in the future version of the project. Overall, some takeaway messages were that basically that they increased attention, focus and attention on marginalized populations was a priority for out school and non-literates, in school but at risk of dropping out children. We believe that this project overall identified the inequalities that existed in the first place as to why these kids couldn't go to the regular system, and tried to address those, not just by providing an alternative model, but making sure that model was quite holistic to the range of needs, some of the supply side ones in terms of simple access, but also the demand side ones that are a little more challenging to both understand and then to respond to. And that's the wider sort of set of programs that we put in there to try and overcome those sort of the barriers and those inequities that were already kind of there. Flexibility was a priority, and that was promoted throughout. And then overall, addressing inequality requires equal attention to developing the personal, social, and financial assets of the marginalized populations. I think that's the last slide. Yeah, thanks very much. Well, plenty more I could obviously say about that. I've rushed through that quite quickly, but please do either drop any questions into the Q&A, or we can respond to them in the discussion.
Thank you, Pete, and thank you, panelists. This is certainly very engaging, and I think provides a rich overview of both the different types of programs that a range of organizations are using to try and accommodate the very difficult circumstances that a lot of these adolescents and youth find themselves in. And thanks as well to Jen and Kayla for starting us off with the frame with which to consider a lot of these programs. So now I'm going to turn it over to Martha Hewison, who's going to lead us in a discussion of questions and answers and just observations about the different presentations we've heard. Over to you.
Great, thanks Cornelia. I hope you can all hear me okay. So we've had lots and lots of questions, but I think I just wanted to first of all say a really big thank you to all the panelists, and I think those presentations really show the diversity of programming. And as Pete highlighted, reaching the most marginalized is definitely not business as usual, and it really requires this flexibility of programming. And I think that taxonomy highlights these huge variety of terms and the challenge in developing a taxonomy that enables all the programs to fit into different categories. And I think that brings us to a question from Yvonne, which was for Kayla and Jen: why do language classes fall into the other non-formal education category? So that's a question for Kayla and Jen.
Jen, did you want to jump on that?
Sure, sorry, I was obviously muted. Yeah, so I mean, I think that, you know, when we gave that example in the presentation, we certainly were sort of referencing, you know, a certain type of language program, a language program that might be supplemental to other educational programs. You know, if an alternative education program has a language component, or if you're talking about a transitional program where the adaptation to the language of instruction in host country, then it may fall into a transitional education category. I think that it's the other non-formal education category is sort of meant to be a catch-all for programs that are often a little bit more, a little bit less structured, a little bit more ad hoc. So, I think that, the example reference would be if older age learners were doing sort of, a few hours of language instruction through a specific program that was, again, helping them to ultimately gain skills to get a job or gain skills to then make educational decisions once they had the language of instruction for other program options. I think that really, the purpose of that falling into the other category is simply to show that it's, it can be, that sort of language program can take on various types of structure with various sort of ultimate objectives. And that's why we put it in that category versus the very distinct alternative programs, which are really aimed at competence and equivalency.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jen. And then we have a couple of questions around the very important certification. We have a question from Gabrielle around, is certification always linked to the Ministry of Education / government? And if not, who is certifying non-formal education or alternative education programs, specifically in crisis-affected context? So maybe I can first ask you, Kayla, to talk about that, then we'll open it up to the other panelists.
Sure, thanks, Martha. So when we're talking about certification of equivalent competencies, just sort of thinking back to the taxonomy, we're talking about that sort of the higher box of the non-formal education, so the alternative education programs, such as accelerated education, alternative, basic education, but also skills-based programs as well. And so in the alternative education space that are academically focused, I would say that yes, the certification processes are very closely aligned with or through the ministries of education and through the government, or at least they should be. So learners in non-formal academic programs should be able to sit national exams and pass national exams. The curriculum should be aligned enough so that they can pass national exams. Their policy should be in place that non-formal learners should be able to sit those exams, and they should get the same certification or diploma as formal school students. And that aligns also with UNHCR's refugee strategy, which specifies that the host country is the country who should be certifying learning by refugee learners. Of course, Martha, correct me if I'm wrong about that at all, but but then the other box on the alternative level, which is where we're looking at certification, is skills training programs. And that's a bit different and less straightforward than academic focused programs that can align with formal education. So in the skills-based programs, we saw a couple of different options. They might be aligning with, or at least working closely with TVET systems. They also might be working with or aligning with professional certification bodies or authorities within countries, or even international certification boards. So one of the programs we were looking at, which is implemented by EDC, Akazi Kanozi in Rwanda, folks were getting certifications through the Rwandan Workforce Development Authority. But then we've also seen, for example, in Proyecto Metas in Honduras, they were getting certified through an international certification board. And it's interesting too, because it's not just certification in technical skills that we were seeing, but also certification in employability or business skills and other life skills as well. So there's quite a bit more sort of variety on that side of things. And I was also really interested in hearing what other presenters were seeing in their particular programs.
Yeah, do we have anyone else that would like to jump in on that and contribute?
I think just to say that this is always, a question that we're faced with, especially when talking to parents and caregivers in community, and that they really want to ensure that whatever non-formal education program their child is participating in, that there's a clear pathway to entry into the formal system, or at least recognition or accreditation of that non-formal education program, to ensure that the time their child spends in that program is leading to something. And it is a challenge, in a lot of contexts, but I do think that, having more clear guidelines from the Alternative Education Working Group has definitely helped in increasing our ability to have some of those conversations at country level. So I think we're making good progress. Since we know, some children really need either an accelerated learning program or, whatever it is so they can catch up. And we have to look at how we're differentiating our approaches to support every child.
Thanks, Julia. And then we have a kind of follow-on question from Rose. How are we addressing the transfer of formal school grades, accomplishments, credentials among countries during migration? So I thought maybe that was a good one for Julia and Alison, if you're working with the Syrian refugees. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sorry, how we're supporting I missed that.
Sorry, let me ask again. How are we addressing the transfer of formal school grades or accomplishments credentials among countries during migrations? So basically the recognition of grades from other countries and the transfer of them.
Right. So we actually right now, our regional office in the Middle East has put together an entire durable solutions strategy. And a big component of that is ensuring this kind of cross-border recognition of education programs, so that as, specific in the Middle East with the Syria crisis, as children are being educated in either Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, and then return home, ensuring that education program they participated in is recognized and enables them to register in the formal school. All that is kind of still in process and at varying stages, but that is something that we're definitely thinking about as we really do, as I think an entire sector, focus on providing these durable solutions for refugee populations, which is really critical.
Great. And then we have, I think it's particularly with this time of COVID-19, where formal systems are having to adapt in, several different ways to ensure learners continue to learn. And also we need to try and look at more flexible systems. And I think that the formal education system can really learn a lot from the non-formal education system. And we have a question from Anne. Specifically, again, you're very popular for Julia and Alison, but everyone can answer. I think given the impact of COVID-19 will transcend for 1 to 2 years, what adaptations are you considering for the Return to Learning program to support children and parents, not only in programming, but also in measuring outcomes?
Yeah, so I was able to answer that question in the chat.
Oh, you've already answered. Okay.
Yeah, so I don't know if you want me to, if there's other questions, just because the answer's there, people can read it.
Okay, yeah, I didn't realize that had been answered. Sorry, it's my first time to be a discussant, and it's a very tricky job, I tell you. So no, we have a question for Jackie from Ash Hartwell, and this is particularly linking in with the inclusion of these kind of programs in education sector plans and access to public funding. So Jackie, Ash asks, is there any public funding for the programs that you're implementing in DRC, and are they part of the national education sector plans? And if not, what is the strategy for influencing education policy to address out-of-school children and youth? Excuse me.
So yes and no, and I would say, DRC, given that it's had over 2 decades of conflict with very poor governance systems, the new government that came into power in last year, 2019, has a lot of work ahead of them and a lot of competing priorities. And one of, I think, our biggest accomplishments has been the development of the curriculum that I mentioned. So giving these programs for out-of-school youth some basic curriculum that matches the objectives and meets the needs of the population is the first big hurdle. And that was advancing quite well in discussions with the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Social Affairs. However, the new government decided to review the national curriculum, so they've just released that in January of this year. So it's now a re-adaptation process that's going on. And they've also decided to increase the primary school grades to include grades 7 and 8. So some of the challenges that we see in these really fragile, volatile environments are also at the systems level, where there's lots of change and a real need to work in building a system from scratch.
Okay, thanks. And I think a couple more questions just to try and get through them, the ones that haven't been answered, is we have a couple of questions around, one from Louis about how, if at all, are students with special needs, disabilities integrated into non-formal education programming, all the programs described today. And another question from Bal about similarly how to address anxiety and stress and the fear of displaced children, so really psychosocial support. So maybe I can just hand that over to the panel. Who would like to talk about that, the incorporation of psychosocial skills and students with special needs and disabilities into the programs we've talked about today?
I can say something quickly on that. Maybe I'm sure lots of other people have things to add as well. I mean, there's certainly no easy answer to that. It's a huge challenge, but it does kind of cut to the core of some of why these kind of programs are needed, because they are obviously for people who are in particular groups or vulnerabilities that then causes them to drop out. In the kind of locations, I think, where we're talking about, where we're working, particularly around disabilities, the access, and this was I mentioned this in a question actually as well, but in the Philippines project, there was limited connection to the health service and the health system, and that was highlighted as a challenge, particularly around disability, because that's often an element that's very helpful to support. As in, if children who are identified as having specific needs, specific health needs, including psychological ones, they'll need a referral mechanism, some sort of referral system. So building that in, or at least recognizing the need for it, and recognizing where the gaps in any either protection or health systems are that then could be supported through the project, or where referrals could be made or anything kind of like that for children with particular additional needs or special needs or educational needs, is kind of a key one. It's not easy to do. The other element to that is maybe doing something around, well, when we tend to focus on teachers as the entry point for when it comes to disability, for example, as similarly with protection needs, as identification and then referral and response as well. There may be certain things that a teacher can do simply in their classrooms to integrate, to not exclude children with those additional needs, but they may also then have a role to play in terms of identification of those special additional responses, especially if they're traumatic and non-visible, that they could then refer on to another mechanism if possible. So teacher training is tended to be our entry point to that, but having an integration within the project, at least in some sense of the health services and the wider child protection or adult protection services, is sort of necessary as well.
Great, thanks, Pete. And would someone else like to talk about how their program's managing that?
I think for IYDA and the DRC, I touched quite a bit on the management of stress and the psychosocial support. So just to reiterate that building on the psychosocial support and the interventions that have been laid in Eastern Congo by various interventions, we're really promoting an approach that's coming from the mental health field, and specifically using cognitive behavioral approaches that kind of goes beyond the community-based psychosocial support. And we find this is increasingly relevant throughout the world as the stress related to the COVID pandemic and the school closures and the social distancing is a reality for so many young people and communities and old people.
Thanks, and I think we just have a few minutes left, so I just wanted to come back to COVID And I know that you've already answered Anna's question, so I won't ask your question again, but I just wanted to ask for the panelists just to give their views about what adaptations have they made to their programs since COVID? Have you actually made any program design adaptations, or have you managed to scale up your programs or had to close them? But just a few thoughts around that. What have you done with your programs in response to the COVID pandemic? I can nominate people. Maybe Pete, I can start with you.
Sure, I can start. Yeah, I mean, this project, I think, like a lot of our projects, we're seeing the, the specific relevance for now in two ways. One, because of the mechanism, things like either having distance programming, like we had in the RAISE project. So that was great, and we've been able to use that and expand that right now. Again, there's a challenge with that. It's not suitable necessarily for everyone. It takes some coaching, it takes some facilitation, but it's there and it's appropriate. So there's ones around the mechanism that's available and that we can use. The other one is the learning and the knowledge that we have around the challenges around who the children and young people are who can access. So additionally to the special needs and educational disabilities and so forth that we talked about, and the traumatic issues and that kind of stuff, there's other ones around connectivity, for example, if anything's digital, or additional challenges now that if they're based at home and they don't, and time poverty and all that kind of stuff. So there are sort of those two elements. One is I think we've been able to respond to the mechanism needed to get educational content to people through this project. That's taught us some things about that. And the other one is that we've been able to sort of adapt and respond and consider, because we have a bit around additional exclusion that might come and additional barriers that might come, and the inequalities from that. So I think this project in the Philippines at least has allowed us to quite quickly respond to something like COVID-19 and a school closure. And hopefully that will be a learning for the ministry going forward there.
Great, thanks, Pete. And maybe Jackie, do you have any learnings from your program in Congo?
Sure. So right now, all of the schools in the DRC are closed. And so we are working on being able to pivot rapidly and use interactive radio instruction to support our youth. And we're also considering the increased levels of stress amongst the population. And so building off of the resilience curriculum that we have developed, we're also going to be integrating some specific radio instruction to support youth and their families during this time.
And Julia or Alison, the last words from you. Any thoughts about that?
Well, one of the exciting things that Julia didn't put in her response in the Q&A is thinking about that evaluation piece. And so we're doing some at-home learning through Return to Learning in a separate project in Colombia that Julia mentioned. And we're actually going to be doing weekly learning comprehension checks to sort of monitoring learning over the course of the program. So we're not seeing those losses that we've seen in previous pandemics and school closures. So that's a sort of an exciting alternative to how we would normally assess learning outcomes.
Great. Well, just to say thank you to the panelists. I see we just about up on time, so I'll hand it back to Margie. But thanks all for listening.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Martha, and thank you to all of the panelists. This has been a really enriching discussion around alternative education, one of many just to start us off. Please, if you have not already done so, go to inee.org and become a member. You can opt in to receive information about alternative education in particular. There you'll see opportunities for engaging in future webinars and in future events related to this thematic area of work. One more time, just thank you to all of the participants and panelists for today's great webinar. The recording will be available and shared with all registrants soon. So thank you and have a great rest of your day, everyone. Take care.